I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We're talking with James Dunley. He's a fifth year a psychology PhD student, and he's going to talk to us about how children and adults reason about the criminal justice system. Thank you so much for chatting with us. And could you tell us a little bit about how you entered into this field and why the scientific approach was exciting for you for this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to chat about this work. So I'll touch a little bit upon this in my slides too, but I really got into this area because it was kind of an observation about the world. I think that a lot of psychologists have a curiosity about the world around them. We ask questions about why the world is the way it is. And so I took some classes as an undergrad about the criminal justice system in the United States, and I knew before it was kind of messy, but taking formal classes in this area was eye-opening to me. And I was like, how can this happen? Like, what is going on in the United States, and why are people here psychologically? What are the psychological drivers of kind of injustices within the criminal justice system? And so I became really interested in understanding, kind of the thinking and reasoning that leads to these really negative outcomes in the justice system context. And so that's kind of what got me interested in this area. And again, I'll touch upon this a little bit in my presentation, but I'm a developmental psychologist. And so basically what that means is that all my studies pretty much include both children and adults, and we're asking them the same set of questions. And so we're asking them about what they think about the legal system, what they think about rules and laws and punishments. And really what that's doing is that it's allowing us to understand how thinking and reasoning and behaviors are changing over the course of the lifespan. And so although we're not following each individual child from the time that they're at elementary school to the time they're adults, we're getting these cross sections of different ages. And so by doing that, we're kind of trying to understand, what aspects of thinking and reasoning might stay the same, and what aspects of thinking and reasoning might be different across these ages. And the ones that are stable across different ages, that might suggest that that part of thinking and reasoning is really central to kind of how our brain is set up to think about these topics. And so that's kind of a really interesting thing for developmental psychologists, because we're kind of mapping, the architecture of these social concepts and how they might be changing or staying the same over time.
Forget I'm muted still. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to take it away. Everyone who's here, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt or ask, or put them in the chat, and I will do the interrupting for you as usual. Thank you so much, James. Take it away.
Yeah, of course. And again, really any questions you have throughout the presentation, please ask. I'm happy to be interrupted. Okay, so a little bit more introduction and more kind of explanation about how I kind of got across these different areas, because it's kind of a non-traditional topic for a developmental psychologist to study. And so especially to the students who are here who are thinking about what they might want to do in the future, I wanted to share a little bit about how kind of these different areas came to fit together in my own brain, and how it makes sense of how I got here. And so basically, when I was an undergrad, I started out studying human development. And so basically, that's kind of the scientific study of how people are, kind of growing up in their environment and what types of factors are shaping their lives. So these factors can be internal, so like their biology, but also the experiences that they're having out in the world. And so their social interactions, the laws and policies that are around them in their lives, and all those things interacting together to shape, who they come to be in the future. And so when I was an undergrad, I was especially interested in kind of understanding how people's social experiences kind of shape their thinking and reasoning across, childhood into adulthood. One type of social experience that I was really interested in as an undergrad was people's contact with courts and legal system, and shaping their kind of reasoning about that system itself. And so I was really fast in this area and ended up doing some work as a research assistant. And so for anyone who's interested in, going on to conduct research in college, I highly recommend doing it. And it's a really great time to kind of test things out. After I graduated, I wanted to get some more formal training in law and kind of an understanding of technicalities in the legal system. And so I decided to get a master's degree in law itself. And so despite the fact that I had a background in psychology, I wanted to transition a little bit to better understand the law, to ask better questions in psychology. And so I got a master's degree in law and then finally transitioned back into psychology to combine these two different areas of psychology and law, developmental psychology specifically, to really kind of be asking these really pointed questions about how people's reasoning about one type or one kind of sliver of the legal sector changes over development. And so that really translated in me to asking questions about what people think about incarceration. And so that's what I'll be talking about with you all today. And if you have any questions on career stuff or what you might want to study much later on, I'm happy to chat about those questions as well. Okay, so like I mentioned a little bit in my introduction, the work that I'll be talking about today, my curiosity in this topic started off with an observation that I had about the world, which to me was revolutionary at the time, but to many social scientists was not so novel. So that the United States has a higher rate of incarceration than any other country in the entire world. And so just to be really clear, what I mean by incarceration is people spending time in jails or prisons in the United States. So to kind of give you a ballpark about what the US incarceration rate is, it's a lot. So compared to some other countries that people oftentimes look at in comparison, per 100,000 residents, the United States is incarcerating around 700 of them. If you look at other countries, not even close, right? So the United States incarceration is a lot. To put this in kind of more concrete terms, currently around 2.3 million people are spending time in jails or prisons in the US. And this is likely an underestimate because we don't have a really great sense of the number of people spending time in jails. That number isn't tracked the best. And so this is likely an underestimate. This also translates into around 50% of families in the United States have some family member in their relatively close family network of having experience being incarcerated. So this is kind of a wild thing for me that half of people in the United States have a family member who have spent time in the prison or jail system. And so this is a really common event that is happening in the US context. And I will also just kind of make a qualification before I go on. This is obviously an aggregate number. So this is a big average of all the people in the United States. But this number does differ based upon kind of the social groups that we might be talking about. And so we know that this number is much higher for people who are marginalized on the basis of their race and ethnicity compared to people who aren't, so compared to white people. But again, this is just an aggregate number that I'm reporting, but I'm happy to talk more about any differences people might be thinking about. So, this is a really common event, incarceration. But it really struck me as a psychologist or a budding psychologist that, we don't really study this topic in psychology. And so I really began to wonder, well, what might be kind of the, social underpinnings of why we incarcerate people, or maybe how we think about people who have been incarcerated. And so I was really curious about how people reason about, individuals who have entered the legal system and have left. And, after a long line of, question and answering with my advisors, we came to kind of the question of what do people think about the causes of legal system contact? And the point as to why this is important might be clear later in the presentation, but really our inferences about why people are incarcerated can really be impacting how we feel toward those people, how we act toward those people, And so really, this is a kind of important question for that kind of reason. It might be impacting our attitudes and judgments. So in addition to not really having a great sense of what people think about the causes of incarceration, we definitely don't know why or how these forms of thinking might be changing across the lifespan. So from childhood into adulthood. And so I'll get a little bit into, again, why that's important in just a slide. And so these are the questions that I was really interested in asking my own work and what I'll be talking about today. So stay tuned for kind of the answers to those questions. And so again, I talked a little bit about this before, but you might be wondering, why does it matter what kids think about incarceration? So kids aren't the ones who are, maybe policing others, and kids aren't the ones who are, putting people in jails or prisons. But I can, maybe convince you that it matters certainly what kids are thinking about these topics. And so one thing that, psychologists think a lot about is, what are kind of the psychological foundations that lead to, adults thinking and reasoning and behaviors much, much later in life. And so really by testing both kids and adults in the same research experiments, we can really get a sense of what aspects of thinking and reasoning are the same across all these ages. And that's kind of important for developmental psychologists to know, because it can tell us which aspects of the brain kind of aren't changing that much over the course of our lives. And those are kind of really stable aspects of our social reasoning. I should note that there's a lot of studies out there that have found this. And so it's not this kind of uncommon thing that our thinking and reasoning stays the same. But for example, in kind of the political psychology domain that I study in, people have found that children's temperament during infancy and toddlerhood can even predict their political orientation and voting behavior as adults. And so this might sound very shocking, and I am certainly even shocked by this when I read it. But this really goes to show that our formative kind of environments as children can really be predictive of kind of adult behavior and thinking. And so it's important to map out how these things might be happening. And so this work is doing that. I will also note that it's kind of pragmatic, right? So children will grow into adults. And like I said, the things that they're learning as children and thinking as children can, again, really be impacting, what they're like as adults. And so children grow up to be lawyers and judges and police officers who, are really making these real world decisions about, who are we punishing and how are we punishing and what types of, policies should we be supporting in the criminal justice sector. And so, again, I think that studying children is a really important way to be, kind of thinking about how these things might be changing over our lives. But also, if there's some sort of kind of problematic aspect of people's, inferences or judgments that might lead to negativity or kind of intergroup bias, it's kind of pragmatic because we can intervene on thinking, during childhood as a sort of way to mitigate bias in the future. So I probably don't have to convince you all, but there's a lot of kind of negativity toward people who have been implicated in the legal system, right? And so if this bias emerges very early on, and spoiler, it does, we can kind of think of ways as psychologists to intervene on those kind of negative attitudes early on in life, because if we intervene early on, that can kind of mitigate the development of these kind of nasty intergroup attitudes later on. Does that all make sense to everyone so far? Kind of why it's important? Okay, cool. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to be talking you through some studies that I've actually done as a PhD student. I'm not sure kind of everyone's comfort or kind of familiarity with interpreting graphs, and I'm going to walk through these graphs pretty slowly, but please, again, let me know if you have questions or additional, time you want to spend looking at them, because I'm happy to really, convey them appropriately. Okay. So the first study I'm going to be telling you about is measuring people's ideas about why people come in contact with the criminal justice system, specifically why they're incarcerated. And so these pictures here are my lab at Columbia, and so it might not be the typical lab environment that people oftentimes think of, and so we don't have beakers and test tubes like a lot of the hard science labs here at Columbia, but this is our lab, and so we bring children and adults into our laboratory space, and we have different testing rooms, and we conduct our experiments there. And so I just wanted to show everyone what pictures of some other labs might look like as well. And so here in the work that I'll be talking about, we tested both children and adults. We focused specifically on children who were ages 6 to 8 years old for a couple different reasons. And some of that are scientific reasons, such that kind of related to the hypotheses that we were testing. I'm not going to go into that today, but I'm happy to talk more formally about that if people have questions. But that's kind of a second reason that we tested this age group is kind of pragmatic. And so really around the ages of 5 to 6 years old, kids start to have a explicit understanding of what prisons and jails are. They can tell us what they mean at that age. We did some kind of pilot testing with younger children, and they were kind of confused of what those words were, or they couldn't give us definitions of them. So we decided not to test those younger kids and really focus on children in these ages. And so these are all elementary schoolers. And so in this study, we asked participants kind of this simple question: why do people go to jail? We also asked a similar iteration as well, where we swapped out the word prison for jail. And it turned out that that difference didn't make a difference in our results. So people responded pretty similarly to those different words. There are lots of differences between jails and prisons, and I can talk about those if people have questions, but I just wanted to mention that before we go on. So basically what we did is we asked participants this open-ended question, and they told us their thoughts about it. We also asked them some closed-ended items where they used a scale to indicate their agreement with different responses. I'm not going to show you those results, but basically they look the same as the open-ended results. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about why this method is kind of cool. So asking open-ended questions is a really important tool in psychology because it allows participants to tell us what they kind of think without being influenced by an experimenter's questions that they're giving them. And so, for example, if we said, do you think that people go to jail because of their behavior? Do you think that people go to jail because of bad policing practices? By asking people to rate their agreement with those items, first, we might be influencing kind of their thoughts about these topics. And so by asking this kind of broad question where participants are providing their own answers, we really got to see kind of their concepts about these topics without being influenced by what experimenters might be thinking too. And so we had a team of research assistants recording participants' answers to these questions. So people were being video recorded and their responses were taped. And so we had research assistants go through later on and type out participants' responses to these answers. And so then after participants gave us those answers, I went through and looked at all those answers and pulled out kind of themes from some of these responses in different categories. And I'll talk about what those categories were in just a second. So when I was developing these codes or these themes that I was looking for in the data, I was thinking of what people kind of might say. And so there are kind of 3 different categories that I thought that people's responses might fall into. And so 2 of these categories are about the person. So maybe they're about people's internal characteristics. So people are incarcerated maybe for things about their personality or their individual traits. And so we know from a bunch of other work in psychology that people oftentimes explain outcomes about a person based upon their perceived personality or traits. So for example, a really classic kind of example of this is if you have a coworker and that coworker comes to work late every day, and you're asked, well, why is your coworker late every day? People will say things like, oh, well, that person's lazy, like that something about their personality, that they're a lazy person, that's why they're late every day. So they oftentimes make kind of inferences about who that individual is, as opposed to maybe the circumstances that might be surrounding that individual. So it's equally as plausible, right, that, you know, maybe that person lives far away and there's traffic, or maybe that person has to drop, you know, his child off at daycare in the morning, and that's what is making him late. And so that people don't oftentimes consider kind of external constraints when reasoning about people. And so that's kind of why I was thinking initially that, you know, maybe people are making these internal, maybe trait level explanations. It's also plausible that people might be reasoning about the causes of incarceration as linked with behaviors. So maybe people, maybe they're not bad people, but maybe they're just doing bad things. Maybe they're just breaking the law or acting in other ways that are, you know, having these legal implications. And so maybe people aren't going as deep as these internal characteristics, but they're still talking about, you know, behaviors that are linked to the person themselves. And so just as a reminder of these things, we can use these like little emoticons later on when I'm showing the graphs. And so I just wanted to put those there. Another kind of category that I was especially interested in understanding people's reasoning about was whether people thought that incarceration could be caused by an unfair society. And so things that are external to the individual that are set up in a way that are unfair or unjust. We know that certainly this is a factor that is influencing incarceration in the context of the United States. So incarceration, some scholars have talked about incarceration as being both a symptom and a driver of unfair societies or inequality broadly construed. And so despite the fact that in other domains that people haven't really linked people's, you know, individual outcomes with external factors, we thought that maybe, you know, the evidence is so stark in this domain, in the kind of incarceration domain, that maybe people would be picking up on that factor here. So maybe they would be making these external attributions in this domain just because there's so much evidence about it. And so we, you know, just wanted to see if people thought this. And so here's a little emoticon I'll be using when talking about that in the future. Okay, so now we can jump into the first study. And so again, if anyone needs more time to think about this graph, just let me know, and happy to, again, explain more things about it. So here on this y-axis, can you all see my arrow when I'm pointing? Okay, so here's the y-axis, and basically here is the proportion of participants that are giving us a certain type of answer. Over here is the legend, and so here are the different types of categories that I talked about in the previous page. So this internal one was that the little like devil, like the little internal characteristic one, talking about people's traits or personality, behaviors, which are things such as breaking the law, and then societal factors, which is that kind of unfair society, right? And then here on the x-axis, we have the two different age groups that we're looking at. So kids, and then also adults. So what did we find? All right, so basically, when we ask participants the question, why do people go to prison or jail? A lot of kids actually said things about people's personality or their internal characteristics. And so they said things like, people go to jail because they're bad people, they're evil people, they have a bad heart, they have a bad brain, things like that. So they're talking about people's internal characteristics. And so I will tell you in the next study as to why that's a problematic thing. Adults were not telling us that explicitly. So adults weren't making those same types of responses as kids. Next, here are the bars for these behaviors. And so you see here that pretty much across these different ages, this was a pretty common type of response for both kids and adults. So people are both both children and adults are reasoning that people's behaviors and actions are, valid reasons for incarceration. And finally here, I did click the space bar. That is the proportion of people who talked about these kind of external or societal factors in driving incarceration. And so you can see here that no children provide these responses. And out of our sample of 120 something adults, 1 or 2 people talked about kind of unjust society as causes for incarceration. So this was really shocking to me. And I can again talk about, why this might matter.
Could I pop in with a question?
Yeah, for sure.
Did you ever have any participants giving sort of mixed answers, like saying two things at a time, like both internal and action?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so these coding categories were not dichotomous with each other, or they're not mutually exclusive with one another. And so participants could have said multiple things and their responses were coded into, multiple categories.
Okay.
These coding categories don't add up to 100% because some people gave like nonsensical answers, like especially kids, they would say something like, well, jail is jail. That's not an informative answer. And so their responses were coded into this kind of other category. And so that's why these numbers aren't adding up to a perfect 100% bar. But people could offer multiple responses at a time.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And again, another question that I commonly get about these data are, have you looked at the background of the participants? So yes, we did. And so it turns out that we didn't find certain demographic factors as predictive of responses. And so we didn't find that people's political orientation, or at least the adults' political orientation, was predictive of their answers. We didn't find that education level or participant race was linked with their answers. Interestingly, I even ran a second study that was really similar to this one, where we specifically recruited kids who have incarcerated parents themselves, and we asked them the same questions. And both groups of children responded very similarly. So just like the kids in this sample, the kids of incarcerated parents were making these kind of similar internal attributions and also not those kind of external attributions. And again, I can share my thoughts more about that study if anyone has them later on. So before I go on to the next study, why does this matter? Why does, the findings actually, what are the implications of it? Well, actually, like I, mentioned before, an unfair society has a lot to do with why people are incarcerated. And so I can rattle off a bunch of statistics about it, but you can take my word that there's a lot of evidence in favor of the idea that, the way that society is set up in these kind of unequal ways and how it plays out has a lot to do with why people are incarcerated. So for example, some things that some scholars have talked about is people are incarcerated due to factors related to racism. So the color of people's skin, how much money they have, so their SES, their language, their accent, their nationality, where they were born. And so these are all factors that we know have been linked to kind of unfair policing practices. And these are all, again, these external kind of unfair societal reasons that people don't seem to be picking up on, despite the fact that we know this is a reason for why people might be incarcerated. So if we don't, kind of think about these things, we don't necessarily kind of know how to move forward. Many people are interested in kind of, making a more equal justice system or a less unfair justice system. But if we're not thinking about, this is a cause for incarceration, it's kind of like we don't know where to start. And so that's kind of how I'm thinking about why it's kind of problematic as to why people aren't kind of thinking of these external reasons by themselves. In addition to the reasons I just shared as to why this matters, You know, as a social and developmental psychologist, I think that our inferences or our ideas about why people are incarcerated can also impact our attitudes toward people who have been incarcerated. And I'll show you some evidence in favor of that in just a second. So in this second study that I'll show you, and this is the last one, hopefully it's not so much data to throw at you. You know, we're really looking at what the social consequences are of our inferences that we had just talked about. So in this study, we once again interviewed kids and adults. We gave them the same study, and we told them about different individuals. But critically, we told them that different individuals were incarcerated for a different reason. So in this study, we showed participants pictures of 3 individuals, and we said each person was incarcerated for a different reason. So one person was incarcerated because they were a bad person. And this is highlighting this internal characteristic category that children oftentimes mention themselves. We told them that a different individual was incarcerated because of their behaviors, so they did something wrong. And so this was highlighting a category that both kids and adults were talking about. And finally, we told them that a different individual was incarcerated because they didn't have very much money when they were growing up. And so this was a way for us to kind of tap into a societal reason that kids might also understand. I will say that I've actually run 6 iterations of this study per a journal's request. And we use different types of explanations in those other studies. And it turns out that people's responses to those other explanations are really similar to the ones that I'm going to show you here. And so, for example, we also told people about a person who was incarcerated because of the color of their skin, a person who was incarcerated because of unfair policing practices, and those responses look very similar to this societal item here. And so happy to talk more about that, but I also just want to let people know. After we told each participant about an individual and the reason for that individual's incarceration, we asked participants about their attitudes toward that individual. And so we asked them 2 types of questions that kind of measure attitudes, and we did this in different ways. So we straight up asked them, how much do you like this person? And participants used a scale to indicate their responses. And then we also asked them the question, how much do you want this person to live in your neighborhood after they leave prison? And so some other research in psychology suggests that this is a pretty valid predictor of people's attitudes toward individuals. And so we asked them these 2 items together, and participants gave us both answers. And it turns out the responses to these 2 questions were really similar to each other. And so we collapsed them, we made them into a single item of attitude. And so we averaged these responses together. And so I'm just going to be reporting on one attitude measure, but please let me know if that is not clear to you. Okay, so here on the y-axis again, this is attitudes. And so higher numbers are indicating more positive attitudes. So lower numbers then are indicating more negative attitudes. And then here on the x-axis, we have the different categories that we're talking about. So I'm going to put up all the bars at the same time, and then I'm going to talk you through kind of what this means. Okay, so some kind of big picture patterns you might be noticing. So here, when we attributed incarceration to people's internal characteristics, so when we described it by talking about people's moral character, this led to basically people bottoming out the scale. So people were saying, we definitely don't like those people who are incarcerated for internal reasons. If you look all the way to the other side of the graph here for this societal reason, this is leading to the most positive attitudes among both children and adults. We're not maxing out the scale in any way, right? So negativity still seems to be pretty strong, but this kind of explanation is linked with the most positivity that we're seeing. Again, this is important because if you remember in the first study that I talked about, this explanation category was not talked about by either children or adults. So the type of kind of response that is leading to the most positivity or the least bias is the type of response that people aren't thinking about themselves. And so this is kind of a startling result in conjunction with this study. And then finally, this behavior category was between the two extremes of the internal and societal. And so, this led to intermediate attitudes here. And I'm excited to say that this study was actually just published after many, many iterations of it. So yay for that. Okay, so I know I threw a lot of information on everyone here today. So I want to just have some kind of key take homes that everyone should have after they leave today's talk. And then we can open it up to any questions people might have. So people in our first study didn't seem to think that incarceration and societal factors were linked with one another. And so people didn't tell us explicitly that they thought this. But like I mentioned before, certainly societal factors do underlie why people are incarcerated. They really, really do play a strong role in kind of that negative outcome. But what I just showed you again is that thing that is not on people's minds is actually, leading to the most positivity when we, describe incarceration in that way. And so really this can help alleviate stigma toward those who have been implicated in the legal system. And so really, if we're thinking about kind of pragmatics, I think we should be, talking to people about the causes of incarceration, because if you talk about the kind of accurate causes, right, about societal causes, this can help actually kind of decrease the stigma and negativity toward people who have been, implicated in the legal system. So finally, before we get to questions, I just want to thank people who have helped in this research. And so most notably my advisor, Larissa Heifetz, and my collaborators, Red Woolley, and my honor student, Divyani Goel. They have been super helpful in thinking about these projects and actually writing these papers with me. The rest of my lab members down here, and then all the children and families who have participated in this research. So with that, I can open it up to any questions if people have them. And yeah, happy to connect further if you would like to.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. This was very awesome and very interesting. And it prompts the question in my mind, like, are studies like this, potentially going to be used to validate introducing conversations on racial disparities and the criminal justice system earlier in schools, if at all in schools? I know it wasn't talked about when I went through, K through 12 education, but it's extremely relevant to every person in society. But there is like a larger debate at play of like, what should we be telling our kids in school?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I would love if that happened, if we talked, if, this was introduced as some part of curriculum. I think, for people who might not be kind of familiar with, these debates that are going on, some people don't want to be talking about topics like, historical racism in US society because it might in some way perpetuate racism in contemporary US society, might harm children in some way. And we actually find that, talking to kids about these kind of sensitive topics early on is not, harming them. If you're talking to them in, in a developmentally appropriate way, they can understand these difficult topics with, again, appropriate scaffolding. But what that's doing is by addressing these topics and not ignoring these topics, it's kind of making children understand the complexities of these social situations. And, children are actually really, sensitive to injustice and unfairness. And so when you're highlighting these unfair situations early on in life, that actually, if you look at much later on, that's making them into more egalitarian, middle schoolers and high schoolers and adults later on. And so, the work on this topic is actually very nascent about what the consequences are of, talking about these sensitive things early in life and their repercussions. But the evidence that we do have is that it's helpful for mitigating, these harmful attitudes and behaviors much later in life. And so ignoring these difficult topics or saying that everyone is the same. So ignoring people's hardships and saying that, hey, everyone has a very similar life, or everyone, deep down is the same, or the people all have the same struggles. That's not actually very helpful in kind of the project of improving, marginalized people's lives. And so by acknowledging that some people do have hardships and there are differences between groups of people in terms of the kind of, treatment that they have, by acknowledging that, that's how we can actually move forward. And, again, talking to children about this at a very early age is important to do, as long as, again, it's in a developmentally appropriate way. So if this is introduced in schools, I hope so. This evidence shows that kids early on can understand this topic, but I would love if that happened.
Absolutely. I'll pop in with another question, and please, everyone, feel free to add your questions to the chat as well, or interrupt. But so how do you go about finding your participants? This is in a logistical sense. Are they local within the New York area, or is it like electronic surveys? How do you try to make sure that you're getting a broad distribution of types of people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so prior to COVID, my lab used to go out into the New York area, and we would test kids at a lot of different locations. So we have a partnership with the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and so we set up camp in the museum and talk to visitors, and we say, do you want to participate in a study? And we will test them there. We have people come into our lab at Columbia, and so we post flyers all around the city, and people come and visit our lab. So, we obviously pay our participants, and so kids love it. They get, a toy and some money, and they get to talk to some people. And so people come into our lab at Columbia, all from, the New York area, to participate in these studies. We also set up at different farmers markets in the city when the weather is warm. But then COVID happened, and in-person testing was, basically impossible, right? And so what we have done since COVID, and I think we're going to do this in the future as well, is we started to test participants on Zoom. If you see here in the bottom right-hand corner, I thank Zoom for helping us with these studies. So basically, we now have been advertising our lab and our studies on different social media platforms, so Facebook and Twitter, and there's actually a specific website now that has launched to help developmental researchers conduct studies online. And so we post our studies, and people will sign up to do them, and we basically modified all of our in-person procedures to carry out our work on the computer. And so this has actually been great for us, because if we're thinking about representativeness, or getting a wide array of children participating, this is great, because now we have participants from all 50 states participating in our research, as opposed to just the New York area. And one reason why I'm especially excited about that is because New York is a relatively more liberal state, and so the types of messages that kids might be hearing about these topics might be skewed, right? And so just in some of the other studies we've been running, when we're testing kids from other states that might have different, political leanings on average for an area, we're seeing that the responses look pretty different, maybe across locations. And so, this is anecdotal. So far, we haven't formally kind of run the appropriate statistical test to show that there might be differences across areas across the United States and shaping people's thinking about these topics. But it really is actually allowing us to ask interesting questions about how our environments, or maybe the laws that are put into place in a certain area, might be changing people's thoughts about incarceration or incarcerated people. And so I think it's actually really, initially it was stressful to make this transition, but now actually something really good came out of it for our research. So that's kind of logistically how we carry things out.
That's excellent. And it's like set up for, you know, future generations of your lab that you have
Yeah.
that pipeline. Very
Yeah.
cool.
And we even set up a thing in our lab where basically the researcher doesn't even need to be available. We like have families just sign up, and we recorded basically the researcher's role. And so people can like conduct the study at home in their own time, and they can just record it with their camera and send in the recording to us. And so it's actually like this whole new way of doing stuff that we're really excited about. So
Nice. Are there any thoughts of following up with kids that were part of the initial study, like later in life?
so it's really hard to track, you know, children down over time. And we didn't, in these initial studies, we didn't actually like collect the appropriate information to have them contacted again, because a lot of them, again, were tested at like a farmer's market. So we didn't do that, but, you know, going forward in this type of research, I think that it would be something I am interested in doing to actually track, you know, especially if we're thinking about kind of like this study where we're telling people different explanations, to see kind of like how these different explanations might be impacting people over time. So maybe this societal explanation is helping alleviate negativity in the short term, but maybe it's kind of a short lasting effect. Is it, you know, impacting attitudes in a week, a month, a year? I don't know. And so I think that a future direction could be, you know, what is the kind of stability of that intervention? And so I think that's important to look at as well.
Absolutely. Well, if anyone has any questions, please contact James here at his email. Thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday to be here, everyone. This is really awesome and really thought-provoking. And yeah, I'm just really grateful and glad you're studying this and putting this work out into the world.
Thank you. And again, thank you for having me. And again, any questions people have, definitely feel free to reach out. Happy to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Saturday.